All right, I think we're live. Air Church's Bible study of Hebrews 10 just concluded. That's where I was for the past 25 minutes or so. So I just decided to go live. A bit of a spur of the moment decision. And welcome to the people who just arrived. Hi, GW. See, we got a few people trickling in. Anyway, hey, Tommy. Good to see you, Matthew, Enzo. Glad you came. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit. Hi, Scott, Christine, Alejandro. It's always good to see you. Anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about the election since I haven't made a video about the election in a while. I think the last one was about Kamala Harris. Hey, Lisa. And I just wanted to touch on, like I usually, I don't talk about I don't want to get too into the weeds in terms of the horse race, but rather just look at how it's being portrayed in the news media, because I always think that's a lot more interesting than the schematics of the race itself, to because it really is a reflection of what's happening. If you actually look, instead of simply kind of passively digesting the propaganda that's being fed to you, look at the reasoning behind it, why these stories are being published now and for what specific reason. So the big bombshell that was dropped recently this past week was Donald Trump allegedly referring to the gravesite of fallen American soldiers in World War II as losers, and using that as an excuse that he didn't want to visit them. Jeffrey Goldberg, who's the editor of The Atlantic, which republished this completely anonymously sourced story, all of the people that were contacted on the record, and these are vociferously anti-Trump people and people who are resentful of Trump, particularly John Bolton, who's the short-lived national security advisor for President Trump. And remember, this is someone who could not be appointed and not be he could be appointed. He couldn't be confirmed to any cabinet or sub-cabinet level position that required Senate approval because he was that toxic. He wasn't even confirmed as UN ambassador. He was a recess appointment, I believe, as UN ambassador. So this is someone who, aside from a very small sliver of neoconservative, hardcore neoconservative dogmatists, is anathema. No one particularly likes him, and even he has rejected this story. And you would figure he would, if there was any credibility to it, John Bolton would be the one affirming it, if only to boost sales of his political memoir, which the last time I checked was in the remainder bin of Barnes and Noble. So everyone they've contacted who's gone on the record has rejected it, but they stand by it because it's been affirmed by several completely anonymous sources. And keep in mind, this was oh, I didn't know that about him. Well, I mean, I think everyone's a big fan of The Godfather, to be honest. It's a really well-made movie, even though I'm probably in the minority here, but I actually think the novel by Mario Puzo was just as good, and there's a lot more depth to it. The movie itself is sort of, don't get me wrong, the first two movies at least are extremely well made in terms of late 20th century cinema, are probably two of the best dramas, but I think the book is a little bit more polished and there's more depth to it. The films are very aesthetically beautiful and well written, but it doesn't have the same um, it doesn't have the same resonance as the books. Like I said, I'm probably in the minority there. So Jeffrey Goldberg goes on to CNN to affirm his story, even though he admits that he can't find anyone that's willing to go on the record to say this was true. And there have been people who have flat out rejected it, like John Bolton, who are Trump critics and presumably don't have any reason to refute smear refute a smear campaign engineered by the people at the Atlantic. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Radical Love. And that's that's the long and short of it. It's a regurgitation of the tactic that has been tried before. They used his negative comments about John McCain in the 2016 campaign, and Senator McCain was still alive then, so they gave them somewhat. They got some mileage out of it, but one of the interesting aspects of this is why they are bringing this up now. I mean, what is the real rationale for this? You have a story that's unsourced, and make no mistake, when the only people you can find to affirm a story want to remain anonymous, the story is not true. There is a 99.9% chance that it's completely fabricated. So you have a fabricated story that is not that potent. Presumably the aim is to drive some sort of wedge between the president and his supporters who come from a military background, whose families are in the armed forces in some capacity, and to drive up his negatives among veterans in places like North Carolina or Ohio, and as well as Florida, other swing states that have large numbers of veterans and large numbers of active servicemen. That's presumably one of the reasons that this story is being trotted out. But you have to wonder why they would choose this tack. First of all, because if this were 1960 and the Democratic nominee was JFK, who a World War II quote unquote hero. Now, the heroics of JFK are open to dispute. He basically allowed a Japanese destroyer to sink his PT boat, and whether that was because of incompetence or malfeasance or simply a set of bad circumstances, it's questionable about whether his actions were heroic, the actions that led to the sinking. Now, of course, he became a hero because he rescued his men, but Richard Nixon had arguably a more distinguished service record in World War II, despite the fact that he was a Quaker and his family comes from a tradition of pacifism. He actually had a more distinguished service record, but he was able to portray himself as a military veteran, which was essential because of his scant legislative experience and skepticism about his Roman Catholic faith. So he was able to utilize that, and in fact use the quote unquote missile gap as a wedge issue to to defeat President Nixon, even though subsequent to that, it was exposed as a complete lie. So if we were talking about 1960 and you had an actual distinguished veteran from World War II, from the greatest generation, you could conceivably, this would be a persuasive argument, particularly with the Democratic Party of the 1960s. This was before the anti-war movement. This was before the radicalization of the Democratic Party. This was pre McGovern, pre peace power, and when the Democratic Party was still very heavily invested in national security. Harry Truman was the president who, in large measure, oversaw the construction of the post-war national security state. So they were still, and he was the one who created the Truman Doctrine, which was a defense against communism in places like Turkey and Greece, and subsequently NATO countries, NATO members. So at that point, this would have been, in fact, there's a book called A Cross of Iron, which is a really interesting book, which goes into the creation of all these national security agencies in the wake of World War II under Harry Truman. So if this was in 1960 and you had the Democratic Party of 1960 and you had a candidate like JFK, this might be a persuasive line of attack that, even if it was completely fabricated, just like the missile gap, this would be very compelling as an argument, because you had a patriotic Democratic Party which was very heavily invested in promoting themselves as more muscular in terms of foreign policy and national security than the opposition at the time, the Republicans. So if this was 60 years ago, it would be a very persuasive argument. But in 2020, attacking Donald Trump as insufficiently patriotic is not only laughable, but it is just incredibly stupid. And it reeks of a certain desperation, despite the continual, and in a certain regard, this actually mimics what happened in 2016. You keep hearing how Biden is inevitable. Trump, he's going to crush him in the suburbs, and supposedly he does have a large lead in suburban counties, although how long that will hold up in the face of numerous riots and insurrections throughout suburban America is open to debate. We'll see. But when you have a Democratic Party like the one that exists in 2000, which is not patriotic, is not particularly nationalistic, it's really kind of dumb to use that as an attack on the president, especially when there are much more obvious political vulnerabilities. But to say that Donald Trump is unpatriotic, this kind of reminds me of what happened when Reddit banned the Donald. And the ostensible reason for quarantining and then eventually banning the Donald subreddit was not that they found homophobic remarks or Islamophobic remarks or transphobic remarks, which would be the expected rationale, but they didn't use that, because using that as a justification would make the political bias of that website so transparent. So what they said was that people on the Donald subreddit were posting comments of posting comments that were critical of the police. And for anyone who's familiar with that subreddit, they 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 know that that's a, an absurd accusation. To think that supporters of Donald Trump are somehow not only anti-police but posting violent threats against police is so absurd that anyone with any sort of uh you know any sort of IQ above room temperature would immediately apprehend it as a blatant lie. And this is what the military cemetery accusation reminds me of, something that's so absurdly stupid, but that kind of fits into a template for the media, which is trying to defeat Donald Trump by siphoning off a certain segment of moderate Republicans who, I guess you would call them Bush Republicans, kind of siphoning them off in order to drag Joe Biden across the finish line. But the problem is it it's so in conflict with reality, what people can obviously see for themselves, that it's not effective. And it just points to a poverty of imagination with the left, but particularly the media organs that are engineering this. I mean, someone pointed out already that the Atlantic has run stories that are blatant lies, that are just completely that have been completely debunked and disproven, and they've never apologized for it. So when you take someone like Jeffrey Goldberg, who's an habitual liar, and you expect us to believe, and is so resistant to criticism that he doesn't allow comments on his website, you can't expect us to trust that person, or trust an account that's anonymously sourced, particularly one that's so at variance with reality. But I think one of the reasons for this is that it's not a sure thing. Just like when Hillary was destroying Trump in all of these pre-election polls, I'm sure there were internal polls taken that worried the strategists, perhaps not within the Hillary campaign, but I'm almost certain there were Democratic strategists and people in the know who were concerned about a candidate that had such concrete, visible downsides. Now, it's true that Biden, even though he suffers from some of the same shortcomings, the most obvious being a question of whether or not he would be able to fill out his term if he's elected. So the health question is big, and the media is trying to distract from those by making all sorts of ridiculous insinuations about President Trump's health. But but putting that aside, Biden does have obvious advantages over Hillary Clinton, namely that he is not as offensive, as ridiculous as it seems to put him forward as president in his state. He doesn't have any of the obvious drawbacks that Hillary Clinton does. The No one is repulsed by the idea of Joe Biden being elected president. They might be apprehensive about it, again, because of his medical state. They might think it's absurd or laughable, but they're not really that terrified. But the problem is, when you have constant rioting, when you have groups of people, of insurrectionists literally going out on the street, harassing people, destroying their property, setting fire to their property, when you have entire cities like Portland which are under siege by sociopathic communists and nihilists, when you have that being broadcast every day on social media, it it diminishes the appeal of someone like Biden, whose main appeal is a return to normality. It takes the sheen off that candidacy, which is why another tactic, and this and even people who are not fans of the Democratic Party or the left have it conceded that this is something that's a persuasive argument. This idea that you need to elect Biden just to have a respite. The past 7 to 8 months, although really the past, I would say 7 months, 6 to 7 months. So the past half year has been such an insane, intolerable. It's just been a series of cascading catastrophes, one after the other, where people are just terrified. And even even though I live in a relatively safe part of New York and I haven't been exposed to any of the most extreme examples of this cultural unraveling, even I've had to experience, a group of marchers from outside of my town come here and just scream and insult us for about 5 minutes. Now, they were escorted by a police phalanx because a lot of cops live here and they don't want their neighborhoods destroyed. But even that brief 3 or 4 minutes uh, illustrates what people want to have a break from: normal everyday Americans who are still struggling to survive, what they want a respite from. And this this is sort of an inducement for them. If they're worried about Biden's physical condition or mental condition, they they they're being told or being reassured that this will end once Biden is elected. And conversely, this is the stick in the carrot and stick approach. It will continue if he's not elected. So what we've seen over the past 5 or 6 months will just exponentially increase. We'll get more chaos. We'll get more violence. We'll get more prosecutions of people defending their property, like the McCloskeys. We'll just get an increasing number of these type of events until society is irreparably damaged. There's no coming back. And Jeff Deist, who's from the Mises Institute, has a great video about this. He delivered a lecture about this situation, what's going to happen to the United States, and he comes at it from the perspective of someone who is, of course, worried about what's happened and admires America, but is also looking at the bright side that this might lead to a what did Jennifer Aniston call it, or Angelina Jolie, a conscious uncoupling? No, that was Gwyneth Paltrow. She said she was consciously uncoupling from her husband, who I think is in Oasis. I could be wrong about that. I'm not. He's in one of those English bands, but she described their divorce as a conscious uncoupling, and that's Jeff Deist's main idea in this speech, which is worth watching. That this might be something that we're heading to, and I think it would be accelerated if Biden loses. That's one option. But again, I'm not certain about any of this. All my predictions in 2016, political predictions, were not borne out. So I'm not going to give any real prognostications here to tell you whether or not Biden or Trump would win. Ostensibly, Biden is in the lead, but again, that's what we were told in 2016 up until election night. And I was in Manhattan in election night, and it was one of the more interesting experiences I've had, just watching people's reactions and just watching most people lose it entirely. As I made my way from Manhattan to the outer boroughs. Anyway, thanks everyone for coming. The Tower Time, Matthew, Nate, of course, all of the super mods. I think there are a couple of people here who are not mods. Hi, Tom. And hi, Scott. First Corinthians, John. I'm glad all of you came, and I will be back shortly.